For more than 2 centuries, the people of Appalachia have carried a story about themselves that outsiders rarely bothered to question and insiders rarely bothered to defend, because it seemed too obvious to need defending. The story goes like this. The mountain families of eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, western North Carolina, and the hollows of Tennessee are the direct descendants of Scots-Irish settlers, Presbyterian farmers and herders from the Ulster plantation, who crossed the Atlantic in the 18th century, pushed inland past the settled coastal colonies, and carved out an isolated, self-sufficient culture in the folds of the Appalachian range that has remained recognizably itself, generation after generation, in a way almost no other regional culture in North America has. It is one of the most durable pieces of American folk genealogy, repeated in family Bibles, local histories, tourist brochures, and the introductions to 100 books about Appalachian music, speech, and religion. And like most durable folk narratives that survive for centuries without serious empirical testing, it has always existed in an uneasy space between something everyone assumes is true and something almost nobody had actually verified with hard biological evidence. That has now changed. Over the past several years, a wave of population genetics research, drawing on consumer DNA databases, academic sequencing projects, and increasingly sophisticated methods for reconstructing ancestral population structure, has turned its attention squarely onto Appalachia, and the results are forcing a genuine reconsideration of what the region's genetic history actually looks like. Some of what the DNA shows confirms the old story in ways more precise and more dramatic than anyone expected. And some of what it shows complicates that story so thoroughly that it has quietly unsettled a regional identity that many Appalachian families had assumed was simple, singular, and settled. To understand why geneticists became interested in Appalachia in the first place, it helps to understand just how unusual the region's settlement history actually was, from a population genetics standpoint. Between roughly 1717 and 1775, an estimated 250,000 people left the province of Ulster in the north of Ireland for the American colonies in a series of migration waves driven by rising rents, a collapsing linen trade, and religious friction between Ulster's Presbyterian population and the Anglican establishment that controlled Irish civil life. These migrants were themselves the descendants of an earlier displacement, Scottish lowland and borders families who had been settled in Ulster during the plantation policies of the early 17th century, brought over specifically to anchor a Protestant population loyal to the English crown in a historically Gaelic and Catholic province. So the people who left Ulster for America in the 18th century were already, genetically and culturally, a distinct and somewhat unusual population. Scottish in origin, several generations removed from Scotland itself, shaped by a century of intermarriage within a relatively closed community of fellow transplants, and further shaped by ongoing, if limited, intermixture with the Irish Catholic population around them. When they arrived in North America, they largely bypassed the already settled coastal areas of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, which were dominated by English and German colonists with different religious and economic arrangements, and instead pushed directly into the Appalachian backcountry, the Great Wagon Road corridor running down through the Shenandoah Valley into the Carolina Piedmont and the mountains beyond. What they found there was terrain that, geographically, did something that very few other regions of colonial North America did. It isolated them. The ridge and valley topography of central Appalachia, narrow hollows, steep grades, limited river navigation, and a lack of easy overland routes between settlements meant that communities founded in the mid-1700s often remained genuinely cut off from significant new migration and from easy travel to other regions for the better part of 2 centuries. Families married within a radius of a few miles, generation after generation, not out of any particular cultural preference for insularity, but simply because the terrain made marrying farther away logistically difficult. This is precisely the set of conditions that population geneticists look for when they want to study what happens to a human gene pool under sustained isolation and repeated intermarriage within a bounded founder, population. Iceland has long been the classic example used in genetics textbooks. Newfoundland's outport communities are another frequently studied case. It also helps to be precise about terminology, because the label itself carries some genuinely contested history. Scots-Irish and Scotch-Irish are used more or less interchangeably in American usage, though the second term is largely an American coinage that would have meant little to the migrants themselves, who mostly thought of themselves simply as Ulster Presbyterians, rather than as members of any hyphenated ethnic category. The hyphenated identity was substantially built after the fact, in the 19th century, partly as a way for Protestant Ulster-descended Americans to distinguish themselves from the much larger and much poorer wave of Catholic Irish immigration that arrived during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s. That messiness, the point of origin, turns out to matter a great deal once you start trying to read the DNA of their Appalachian descendants 3, centuries later because it means that even a hypothetically ideal ancestral reference panel for Ulster Scots would already contain more internal genetic diversity than the tidy textbook version of the migration story implies. Modern ancestry testing companies, when they report a customer's results as some percentage Scottish, Irish, or English, are working from statistical reference populations that only imperfectly capture this history, which is part of why Appalachian customers frequently report ancestry breakdowns that mix all three. Categories in proportions that would have struck their 18th century ancestors as a strange way to describe themselves, even though the underlying genetic signal is entirely consistent with what actually happened on the ground in Ulster before anyone ever crossed the Atlantic. The first hints that Appalachia's genetic profile might be unusually distinct, rather than just culturally distinct, came not from academic research at all, but from the explosion of consumer ancestry testing in the 2010s. As millions of Americans submitted saliva samples to companies offering ethnicity estimates and DNA matching services, researchers working with the aggregated, anonymized data noticed something odd about the clustering patterns that emerged from customers in central Appalachia. Population geneticists build ancestry estimates by comparing an individual's genome to reference panels, collections of DNA samples from people whose ancestry in a particular region is well documented, ideally going back multiple generations in the same place. When enough customers from a defined geographic area show unusually tight genetic clustering with each other, more so than would be expected from the general regional population, it signals that the area functioned as a relatively closed mating pool for an extended period. Researchers studying anonymized ancestry company data have identified exactly this kind of tight clustering among long-rooted families in parts of eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and northeastern Tennessee, a genetic signature consistent with a population that experienced a real founder effect and a long period of subsequent endogamy. The clustering is strong enough that some geneticists working with these datasets have described Central Appalachian ancestry as forming one of the more genetically distinctive regional populations in the continental United States, more internally similar than the general population of most other American regions, with comparably long settlement histories, including many parts of New England and the Deep South, that experienced substantially more subsequent immigration and internal migration. The method behind these findings is worth explaining briefly, because it is easy to misread genetic clustering as something more mystical than it is. Researchers typically use a technique that treats large numbers of small, common genetic variants scattered across the genome as coordinates, then plots individuals in a kind of multidimensional genetic space where people who share more recent common ancestors sit closer together. When you take a large sample of people who all report 4 or more grandparents born in the same rural Appalachian county, and you find that they sit closer together in that genetic space than a similarly sized sample of people who all report 4 grandparents born in, say, coastal Massachusetts or the Piedmont region of the Carolinas, you have a quantitative measure of relatedness that does not depend on anyone's family stories at all. It is simply a description of the actual statistical structure of the genome. This is, in one sense, simply confirmation of what the family history's already claimed. These are old, tightly rooted communities that intermarried heavily and stayed largely put. But it also means something more specific and more measurable than the folk version of the story ever articulated. It means that a meaningful fraction of the population in the Appalachian core carries a genetic profile shaped disproportionately by a relatively small number of founding lineages from the 18th century, concentrated and reinforced across roughly 8 to 10 generations of relative isolation. In effect, the mountains did to the Ulster Scots settler population something similar to what island isolation does to founder populations elsewhere in the world, narrowing genetic diversity, concentrating certain lineages, and creating a population that is measurably, not just culturally, distinct. If the story stopped there, it would already be a striking confirmation of Appalachian genealogical tradition. But the DNA record complicates the simple Scots-Irish narrative considerably, and nowhere more visibly than in the long and contentious history of the Melungeons. The Melungeons are a group of families, historically concentrated in the border region of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, particularly around Hancock County, Tennessee, who have been documented since at least the early 19th century as a population whose appearance and ancestry did not fit neatly into the racial categories that dominated the American South. Melungeon families were frequently described in historical records with a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and outright hostility, variously classified in different official documents as white, free persons of color, mulatto, or simply left unclassified. Generations of folk explanations arose to account for their origins, some plausible and some frankly fantastical. Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Carolina coast, lost colonists from Roanoke, Turkish or Moorish traders, descendants of Sir Francis Drake's abandoned Ottoman and Moroccan galley crew. Genetic testing conducted on documented Melungeon-descended families over the past 2 decades has produced a considerably less exotic but genuinely interesting answer. Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA studies, along with more recent whole genome ancestry analyses, indicate that Melungeon ancestry is best explained as a mixture predominantly of European, largely British Isles, ancestry, sub-Saharan African ancestry, and, in many family lines, Native. American ancestry, combining in the colonial era Virginia and Carolina backcountry among free people of color, indentured servants, and European settlers under social conditions where such mixing, while heavily stigmatized, was not physically impossible in the earliest and least rigidly stratified period of colonial settlement. What makes this genuinely significant for the broader Appalachian DNA story is that Melungeon families were not a separate, later addition to the Appalachian population. They moved into the mountains as part of the same 18th century frontier migration that carried Scots-Irish Presbyterian families into the same hollows, often settling in the same counties and, over subsequent generations, occasionally intermarrying with families that considered themselves purely Scots-Irish, particularly as strict racial categorization loosened at the local level in isolated mountain communities where everyone had known everyone else's families for generations. The practical result, confirmed by modern genome-wide ancestry testing of self-identified Scots-Irish Appalachian families, is that a non-trivial number of lineages that have understood themselves for 2 centuries as straightforwardly Scots-Irish in fact carry small but detectable and consistent traces of African and Native American ancestry, typically in the range of low single-digit percentages, concentrated in specific documented family lines, rather than distributed evenly across the whole population. For some families, when this shows up in a modern ancestry test, it confirms oral traditions that had been quietly maintained for generations, sometimes referred to obliquely within families as Indian blood, or explained away through vague reference to a great-grandmother nobody talked about much. For other families, it arrives as a genuine surprise, and in some documented cases, has prompted a real reassessment of family identity and community history. Speaking of Indian blood, one of the most persistent claims in Appalachian family lore across every generation is some version of descent from a Cherokee or other Native American ancestor, frequently described as a Cherokee princess, a phrase so common in American genealogical folklore that it has become something of a running joke among professional genealogists and population geneticists alike. Modern DNA testing has been almost uniformly unkind to this specific claim in its most commonly told form. The overwhelming majority of families who report multi-generational oral tradition of direct Cherokee descent, when tested, show either no detectable Native American ancestry at all, or amounts so small as to be statistically indistinguishable from background noise and ancestry estimation algorithms. Genealogists who have studied this phenomenon extensively attribute it to several converging historical and social pressures, a documented pattern particularly strong in the post-civil war and early 20th century South of white families with dark hair, dark eyes, or a family member with unexplained darker complexion constructing a Cherokee ancestor as a socially acceptable explanation, one considerably more palatable in the racial climate of the Jim Crow-era South than the alternative explanations that a Melungeon or mixed-race ancestor further back in the family tree would have implied. But, and this is where the genetic record adds real nuance rather than simply debunking the tradition wholesale, a genuine minority of Appalachian families, when tested, do show authentic, consistent, and traceable Native American ancestry, generally at levels consistent with a single ancestor, several generations back rather than a princess of any prominence, and generally connected not to the large removal-era tribal nations most commonly invoked in family lore, but to smaller, less romanticized indigenous communities that had already substantially intermixed with European settler populations along the earliest colonial frontier by the time the ancestor in question would have lived. In these cases, the genetic evidence and the family tradition align, imperfectly, and with the specific details of the tradition usually somewhat embellished or mistaken, but aligned in the fundamental claim that an indigenous ancestor genuinely existed. The pattern that emerges from this research, taken as a whole, is one that undercuts both the most dismissive scholarly instinct, which for decades treated virtually all Appalachian Native American ancestry claims as pure Jim Crow-era invention, and the most credulous family history instinct, which treats every version of the Cherokee princess story as literally true. The Native American question is worth pausing on a little longer, because the genetic record here is not simply a story of debunking a myth. It also vindicates a smaller number of communities whose indigenous ancestry claims had been unfairly lumped in with the Cherokee princess phenomenon for generations, purely because they came from the same general region and told a superficially similar kind of story. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians, based around the Qualla boundary in western North Carolina, represents the most direct and well-documented case of genuine, continuous Cherokee ancestry and community identity surviving in the Appalachian region, the descendants of Cherokee families who avoided the forced removal of the 1830s known as the Trail of Tears, in some cases by hiding in the mountains, and in others through specific legal arrangements that allowed a small number of Cherokee landholders to remain in North Carolina. But there are other smaller communities scattered through the mountains. Families sometimes referred to informally by local historians using terms like snowbird Cherokee, or by reference to specific documented mixed ancestry settlements, where the genetic and genealogical record shows a real, if more modest and more diluted, continuity of indigenous ancestry going back to the earliest years of colonial contact on the frontier, long before removal, when intermarriage between European settlers and indigenous women was considerably more common on the sparsely populated edge of the colonial world than it would become in later, more racially rigid decades. These are precisely the families whose oral traditions researchers now regard as the most likely to reflect a genuinely accurate, if imprecisely remembered, kernel of history, not because their stories were told more carefully than anyone else's, but because the genetic evidence happens to back them up in ways it does not back up the far more numerous and far more generic Cherokee princess claims that spread across the white Appalachian population more broadly during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Founder populations that experience sustained isolation and elevated rates of consanguinity, marriage between more closely related individuals than would occur in a larger, more genetically mixed population, tend to show two related genetic phenomena that researchers can detect and measure directly in modern samples. The first is an elevated frequency of certain rare recessive genetic conditions, because a disease-causing variant that might be vanishingly rare in a large outbred population can become disproportionately common in a small founder population if one of the original founders happened to carry it. The second is longer runs of homozygosity, stretches of the genome where a person has inherited identical genetic material from both parents, which serve as a direct, measurable signature of relatedness between ancestors further back than can typically be traced through paper genealogical records alone. Medical genetics researchers working with Appalachian clinical populations have documented both of these signatures in the region, and the findings have real practical consequences beyond simple scientific interest. Certain rare hereditary conditions, including specific inherited metabolic disorders and particular forms of hereditary neuropathy, have been documented at meaningfully elevated rates in some Appalachian communities compared to the general U.S. population, a pattern consistent with the kind of founder effect that would be expected given the population's settlement and isolation history. Clinical genetics programs serving the region have, in some cases, developed targeted screening protocols specifically informed by this documented population history, treating the region's distinctive genetic profile as clinically relevant information rather than merely a historical curiosity. Runs of homozygosity data collected from Appalachian research cohorts also provide, in effect, an independent biological confirmation of the isolation that family oral history and historical demographic records had always described, not requiring anyone's testimony or any paper record at all, but readable directly out of the structure of the genome itself in the length and frequency of these identical by descent segments. In some sampled Appalachian populations, researchers have found levels of measured relatedness between individuals who believe themselves to be genetically unrelated that would be more typical of small island populations or other classically studied isolates than of a mainland continental population living within a modern nation-state's transportation network. This has a genuinely practical dimension that goes beyond satisfying curiosity about ancestry. Public health researchers working in the region have had to grapple, in real clinical settings, with the downstream consequences of this genetic history. Physicians practicing in some of the more isolated Appalachian counties have long noted, anecdotally and then increasingly through formal case documentation, clusters of rare inherited conditions appearing at rates that would be statistically implausible in a randomly mixing population. Conditions that in a large outbred city population might turn up once in a physician's entire career, but that show up repeatedly within a handful of extended families in a single mountain county. Some of this has been formally studied and published. Some of it remains the kind of pattern that regional physicians recognize from direct and clinical experience well before it gets formally documented in the medical literature. There's also a demographic irony buried in this research that few of the geneticists studying it have failed to notice. The very isolation that preserved a uniquely well-documented genetic and cultural time capsule of 18th century Ulster Scots life is the same isolation that, for generations, has been treated by outsiders as evidence of backwardness, poverty, or cultural stagnation, the basis for a whole genre of condescending regional stereotype in American popular culture. What makes all of this more than an academic curiosity is the broader cultural context that Appalachian communities themselves have long understood, even without the genetic data to confirm it in quantitative terms. The region's culture, its music, its dialect, its religious traditions, its foodways, has always been understood, both by scholars and by Appalachian people themselves, as an unusually well-preserved transplant of 18th century Ulster Scots and Scottish borders culture, sustained largely intact because of the same isolation that shaped the genetic profile researchers are now documenting directly. Linguists have long noted that Appalachian English preserves grammatical constructions, vocabulary, and pronunciation patterns that closely echo Scots and Ulster Scots speech patterns, largely vanished from the source. Regions themselves, a preservation effect widely attributed to the same isolation that produced the region's distinctive genetic clustering. Folklorists and ethnomusicologists have documented similarly direct continuities in traditional Appalachian ballad singing, fiddle and banjo music, and religious practice, tracing specific tune families and hymn traditions back to identifiable source communities in Scotland and Ulster with a level of continuity rarely matched by any other regional folk culture in North America. The genetic evidence, in this sense, functions as a kind of independent confirmation running alongside the cultural and linguistic evidence that scholars had already assembled through entirely different methods. The same isolating mountain geography that let certain fiddle tunes and certain turns of phrase survive, largely unchanged for 2 centuries, also let certain genetic lineages survive largely unmixed for the same period, and the correspondence between the 2 lines of evidence, one cultural, one biological, is part of what has made this research so compelling to the population geneticists who have taken it up. One of the more unexpected extensions of this research has involved tracing the same genetic signature outward from Appalachia into the parts of the country that later Appalachian outmigration populated. Beginning in the early 20th century and accelerating dramatically during and after the 2 world wars, hundreds of thousands of Appalachian families left the mountains for industrial jobs in cities like Detroit, Akron, Cincinnati, and Chicago, forming what regional historians have long called the Appalachian diaspora, communities of transplanted mountain families who often remained socially and culturally distinct within their new urban settings for a generation or more, sometimes clustering in specific neighborhoods that came to be known informally by names referencing their Appalachian origins. Population geneticists working with modern DNA databases have been able to detect this same distinctive Appalachian genetic clustering signal reappearing in unexpected concentrations within the modern populations of exactly these Rust Belt cities, among individuals whose family history records confirm grandparents or great-grandparents who made the move north for factory work. This is, in effect, a genetic fingerprint of a 20th century economic migration showing up clearly enough in 21st century DNA data to be identified without needing to already know the family history in advance. The genetic signature and the documented migration history independently confirm each other, in much the same way the original 18th century Ulster migration and the Appalachian founder population signature do. This diaspora research has practical value beyond its historical interest because some of the same rare hereditary conditions elevated in the Appalachian core have also turned up at correspondingly elevated rates in these diaspora communities decades after the original move north, a finding that has occasionally surprised physicians in cities far from Appalachia who were not necessarily aware that a patient's family history included mountain ancestry until genetic testing pointed them back toward exactly that population history as the most plausible explanation for an otherwise puzzling case. The current wave of Appalachian population genetics research remains, by the admission of the researchers most actively engaged in it, incomplete in important ways. Much of the strongest data currently available comes from aggregated consumer ancestry testing databases rather than from dedicated academic sequencing projects with the kind of deep, documented multi-generational genealogical verification that the strongest population genetics research ideally requires. Sample sizes for some of the more specific claims, particular rates of Melungeon-associated ancestry in specific counties, for instance, or the precise scale of documented Native American ancestry among self-identified Scots-Irish families, remain smaller than researchers would like, and the geographic and socioeconomic representativeness of who chooses to take a consumer DNA test in the first place introduces potential biases that academic researchers are still working to fully account for. Several university-affiliated research groups working in collaboration with regional historical societies, and in some cases, directly with the extended families whose multi-generational Appalachian roots make them ideal research subjects, have begun assembling more rigorously documented genealogical genetic datasets intended to address exactly these limitations, combining paper genealogical records extending back to the original 18th century settlement waves with modern whole genome sequencing in an effort to build a dataset precise enough to answer some of The more specific and contested questions the consumer database research has raised but not conclusively settled. What is already clear, even before that more rigorous research is complete, is that the folk story Appalachian families have told about themselves for 2 centuries was never simply invented out of nothing, and was never simply confirmed exactly as told either. It was a reasonably accurate memory of a real historical migration, preserved with real fidelity through genuinely unusual geographic isolation, but also selectively remembered, selectively simplified, and in places selectively distorted by 2 centuries of social pressure that shaped which ancestors got talked about at the family table and which ones quietly disappeared from the story. The DNA does not replace that family story. It does something more interesting. It goes back into the ground of the genome itself and tells you, with a precision no oral tradition alone could ever achieve, which parts of the story were true all along, which parts were embellished, and which important parts were never told at all. For a region whose identity has always rested heavily on the question of where its people came from, that is not a small thing to finally have an answer to, even a partial, provisional, still developing answer, arrived at not through the stories families chose to tell about themselves, but through the far older and far more honest record carried quietly for 250 years in their blood.